everyone, my name is Amber Moore and this is a case study for EDL-853. So in this case study, who is a student? Who is the person that we're looking at? We're looking at a student named Miguel. He is a high school senior and starting quarterback. During the football season, however, he ended up suffering a spinal cord injury in a football game. So now he has to utilize the support of a wheelchair to get around. The doctors have cleared him to return to school. And at this point, it's clear that he needs physical setting accommodations in order to be able to get around the school building safely, but he does not require any academic accommodations. I can't change the direction of the wind, but I can adjust my sails to always reach my destination. Jimmy Dean. I think this was appropriate in this particular case because in Miguel's case, things changed pretty drastically for him. And even though we can't change the direction of the wind, we can always adjust our sails. So who are the individuals involved in this particular case? So at Nottingham High School, we have Miguel, who is a student, Mr. and Mrs. Hernandez, who are Miguel's parents, and then Howard Carey was the attorney that they hired to fight for Miguel's rights to an appropriate education. At the high school, we have Miss Guzman, who's the school guidance counselor, Dr. Harvey is the superintendent, and Mrs. Moore is the high school's principal. So what is the conflict in this case study? Well, Miguel's counselor has decided to change his science class because the classroom of his biology class, specifically, is not wheelchair accessible. However, the problem is that Miguel needs his biology class in order to qualify for the university that he plans on attending. So the parents have hired a lawyer to fight for Miguel's right to be in his biology class. They do not want his schedule changed and they don't want him removed from his biology class. There was a meeting before school started and before Miguel returned to school, and it was never discussed that he would be removed from his biology class. He did not find out until he returned to school. So there's some important laws that I think we need to consider when looking at this situation. And the first one is Section 504 Rehabilitation Act, and specifically in regards to FAPE. And really what it says is that any person who has a disability, defined as either physical or mental, and in this particular case is physical for Miguel, they are required, or districts are required to provide them with a free, appropriate public education. I also think it's important to mention, well, what is appropriate? How do we define appropriate? And at the bottom of the slide, it mentions education services designed to meet the individual education needs of the students with disabilities, specifically as adequately as the needs of non-disabled students. So when thinking about appropriate, is it appropriate to remove Miguel from his biology class simply because he cannot access it, which is at no fault of his own, when his non-disabled peers can access that same classroom? Some additional laws that I think we need to consider as well is the Americans with Disabilities Act. This specifically relates to employment and accommodations, public accommodations, making sure that facilities are accessible to individuals with disabilities, specifically if they're using wheelchairs, those kinds of things. In Miguel's case, based on the information provided, under Nebraska law, he would not necessarily qualify as a student who requires an IEP. And that's simply because he doesn't meet the 3 prongs. And one of those prongs is requiring specialized instruction. At this time, there's no academic needs for Miguel, so he wouldn't necessarily require any specialized instruction from a special education teacher. However, I do think it's important to understand that if things were to change, what does IDEA say and how does it relate to specifically Miguel's case? Individuals with Disabilities Act, it's the federal special education law that ensures public schools serve the educational needs of students with disabilities. And as I said before, in Nebraska, he wouldn't necessarily qualify as a student who needs an IEP at this time. So when thinking about the actions that should have been taken before Miguel returned to school, was there should have been a meeting with parents. And there was, but it should have discussed the plan for Miguel's return, not just simply Miguel's coming back to school, great. Okay, there should have been much more into that. And the reality is a 504 plan should have been developed. And in this particular case, is a 504 plan is developed to ensure that a child who has a disability identified under the law, which he would, is attending elementary or secondary institutions, receives accommodations that will ensure their academic success. And specifically in this case, access to the learning environment. It is the law. And that is one of the things that this school district kind of failed to recognize as Miguel came back to school. And there should have been some parent consent. The parents would have met with the district, there would have been a plan reviewed, and then the parents would have given written consent whether they agreed or disagreed with the plan that was developed for Miguel. We also need to consider at this point in the situation due process. Due process procedures must also provide for an impartial hearing with the opportunity for participation by parents, represented by their counselor, and a review procedure. Hopefully, we can meet with parents and it doesn't come to this, but parents are entitled to due process if that's what it comes to. And I think it's really important to remember that. So, a potential plan of action would be to set up a 504 meeting. Miguel's parents are entitled to due process, so a meeting needs to be set up to discuss a plan for Miguel. It is important that all parties involved understand the law, okay? ADA, Section 504, and FAPE. And then really before the meeting, the counselors, teachers, superintendent, principal, they need to sit down and discuss possible solutions to the lack of access in regards to Miguel's biology class, because the district, it is their responsibility to ensure that he has physical access to his classrooms, okay? Remember that changing his classes due to a lack of physical access is not an option, okay? You cannot remove him from a class simply because of the setup of the school building. So what would happen in a 504 meeting? Well, first of all, parents, teachers, counselor, and administrators must be present. And if the parents are allowed to invite anyone they choose. And so if they invite their attorney, that's absolutely their choice. They are going to discuss Miguel's plans for post-secondary. In Nebraska, our 504 and IEP meetings focus on what does the child want to do after they graduate from high school. And so we build our plan based on helping them meet those specific goals, okay? And then really looking at what are the obstacles that are in place right now that we need to overcome in order to ensure that Miguel is receiving the most appropriate education. Really, the meeting goals are simple. Ensure that FAPE is being followed. Find a way to ensure that Miguel takes a biology class. And ensure that Miguel's education does not change due to his use of a wheelchair. Really what this all boils down to is equitable access to educational resources, okay? That's what this boils down to. And so here are some possible solutions. Some of the things that could happen is having the teacher teach that specific class during that class period in a more accessible part of the building, okay? I know that it's not always easy for teachers to move classrooms, but it is manageable. And research ways to make that part of the building wheelchair accessible. Obviously, it costs money, those types of things, but at the end of the day, that's what's best for Miguel. And honestly, future students. Or the third option, I wouldn't recommend, but I suppose if the team came to this agreement, is to teach that specific class virtually so that Miguel had access to the curriculum. Again, that is probably the most restrictive way to teach that class, so I would not recommend that as it's kind of a last resort. And again, the team must agree to it, okay, including Miguel's parents. Some important points to remember in relation to Miguel's case is specifically he is entitled to FAPE at all costs, okay? His parents were absolutely right to advocate for him by hiring an attorney. That was absolutely the right thing to do on their part. The school cannot change his schedule to fit their needs. That is not an option. It is against the law. The students must meet with the parents, and a 504 plan must be created and implemented. That is also the law. Miguel is diagnosed with a disability and a 504 plan, or in some states, maybe an IEP, has to be developed. At the end of the day, it's simple. Do what is best for Miguel to ensure that he receives access to the same academic programming as every other individual student in the building. Here are my references, and thanks for listening.